It was late afternoon, the kind of golden summer day that seemed to pour light over the earth like warm honey. The air shimmered faintly with heat, and the horizon stretched out in soft waves of gold and blue. The gas station sat on the side of a quiet, nearly forgotten road, its weathered blue pumps standing like silent sentinels beneath an endless, empty sky. A few insects drifted lazily in the air, their tiny wings catching the light. For most travelers, this place was nothing more than a pause, a quick refill before miles of asphalt carried them somewhere else. But for Daniel Miller, this ordinary stop was about to become the crossroads where his life would quietly, but irreversibly, change. He stood beside the pump, his old truck humming softly as fuel trickled into the tank. The faint smell of gasoline mixed with the scent of sun-warmed asphalt, wrapping around him in a haze that only made the heat seem heavier. His shirt was unbuttoned halfway, the collar damp where sweat clung stubbornly to his skin. A bead of it rolled slowly down the back of his neck, disappearing beneath the fabric. He was tired, not the kind of tired that a night's sleep could cure, but the kind that settled deep into your bones and made you feel older than you were. Being a single father had a way of wearing you down like that. Over time, exhaustion stopped feeling like a passing state and became a permanent companion, a quiet roommate you stopped noticing until you remembered what it felt like to be rested. But even with that weight, Daniel smiled when he could. He smiled because his child needed a father who looked happy, even on days when he didn't feel like he had much to give. That was when he saw her. At first, she was only a faint shape at the edge of his vision, a woman standing beside her car, the sunlight pooling over her in soft, blinding gold. Her blonde hair hung loose over her shoulders, strands swaying gently in the breeze. The white dress she wore caught the light and seemed almost to glow, a stark contrast against the worn paint of the old sedan she leaned on. But then, she lifted her hand to her face, and Daniel noticed the tremor. It was subtle, the kind of shaking a person tries to hide. She wasn't just leaning for comfort, she was holding herself together, and barely. Her shoulders moved in the smallest, uneven rhythm, like she was swallowing back sobs she didn't want the world to hear. Her car's trunk was open, and a small, scuffed suitcase rested inside, as if it had been packed in a hurry, without thought for neatness or planning. That was when Daniel noticed the boy, no older than 7, sitting silently on the edge of the open tailgate. His legs swung back and forth in small, restless motions, his sneakers scuffing the bumper. His head was bowed, and though he wasn't crying, Daniel recognized the expression on his face instantly. He had seen it in his own son in the weeks after the divorce, the look of a child trying desperately to be brave while the world around them crumbled. It wasn't the look of a tantrum or fear, it was the silent resilience that came when a young heart had been asked to carry more than it should. Something shifted inside Daniel. Maybe it was the ghost of his own worst days, the memories of when he had stood in parking lots like this one, holding his son's hand and pretending he had everything under control. Or maybe it was that stubborn part of him that simply couldn't turn away from someone who was hurting. He didn't think about what he should do or whether he had the right to get involved. He didn't pause to weigh the consequences. He just moved, without hesitation, without second-guessing, driven by an instinct as old as empathy itself. Daniel didn't know what to say at first. He stood there for a moment, the quiet hum of the gas station and the far-off chirp of insects filling the space where words should have been. The woman was still trying to hide her tears, brushing at them quickly with the back of her hand as if their very existence embarrassed her. Her movements were hurried, almost frantic, the way someone moves when they're afraid that if they pause for even a second, the dam will break entirely. Her hands were pale and delicate, trembling just enough to make her fingers clumsy as they tried to smooth her dress and fix her hair, as if somehow pulling herself together on the outside would make everything inside feel steady again. Daniel kept his voice low, almost hesitant, as he asked if she was all right. She didn't answer in words, only shook her head slowly, lips pressed together in a tight, trembling line that said more than she could manage aloud. The boy beside her glanced up at Daniel for just a second before dropping his gaze back to his sneakers, his legs still swinging idly against the bumper. That small flicker of eye contact was enough to let Daniel see it, the mix of confusion and guardedness, the wariness of a child who learned to read the room before daring to speak. There was something painfully familiar in that glance, something that made Daniel's chest tighten. It was the same silent vulnerability he'd once seen in his own son during those first hard weeks after the divorce, when laughter felt forced and bedtime stories ended with questions that Daniel didn't always have the answers to. Eventually, between halting sentences and long pauses, he learned her name, Claire. Her voice was soft, tired, the kind of voice that came from someone who had been holding in too much for too long. She told him that her car had run out of gas just as she'd managed to pull into the station, and though that was an inconvenience, it was hardly the whole story. The truth came out in fragments, carried more in the weight of her pauses than in the words she chose. She had left her home in the middle of the day with nothing but a hastily packed suitcase and her son in tow. She didn't say much about the man she'd left behind, but Daniel didn't need details. He could read between the lines. The bruised emotions that lingered in her eyes, the slight flinch when a truck roared past on the road, the way she kept glancing at her son as though checking to make sure he was still there, those things told him far more than she realized. Daniel's own life wasn't one of abundance. His wallet carried only enough for the week's groceries, gas for his truck, and maybe, if luck was on his side, a small treat for his boy at the end of the week. But as he stood there, watching Claire's hands tremble and hearing the strain in her voice, he knew that whatever he had, it was enough to share. So he filled her tank himself, ignoring her quiet protests. He dug into the cooler on the passenger seat of his truck and handed her a cold bottle of water and the sandwich he had packed for his own lunch that morning. It wasn't much, just bread, meat, and cheese, but her eyes softened when she took it, as if even the smallest kindness felt like more than she'd expected from the world that day. She kept saying she would pay him back someday, her voice catching on the words like they were too fragile to be spoken out loud. Daniel simply shook his head, telling her the only thing that mattered was getting somewhere safe. When they finally parted ways, it was with the kind of goodbye that seemed heavier than the moment itself, like they both knew it was the end of a chapter either of them had planned to write. Daniel drove home afterward, the image of her tear-streaked face and the boy's downcast eyes playing over in his mind like a song he couldn't get rid of, one whose melody lingered long after the music had stopped. Life moved forward in its usual slow rhythm. There were early mornings and long shifts at the lumber yard, the dull ache in his shoulders by the time he got home. Evenings were spent hunched over the kitchen table helping his son with homework, or washing the dishes while the television murmured softly in the background. Some nights, when the house was quiet and his boy had gone to bed, the loneliness crept in, sitting with him like an uninvited shadow. Still, he didn't expect to see her again. Not so soon. Not at all, really. But the very next afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the front windows, there was a knock at his door. Daniel hesitated, wiping his hands on a dish towel before pulling it open. There, framed in the doorway, stood Claire, her son at her side. She looked different, still tired, still fragile, but there was something new in her eyes, a faint light that hadn't been there before. Her hair was brushed, her dress clean, though both carried the subtle wear of a life still in transition. The boy clung to her hand, but his posture was less tense, his gaze more curious than guarded. For a moment, Daniel just stared, caught between surprise and something else, something that felt like the beginning of a story he hadn't known he was still waiting for. She stood there on his porch, an envelope in her hands, her fingers twisting slowly around its edges as though it carried a weight far heavier than paper. Her eyes held a calm resolve, but Daniel could see the faint tremor in her hands. She said she'd found a way to thank him, but before she could go any further, he shook his head and told her she didn't owe him a thing. He meant it too. Kindness wasn't a transaction to him, it was just something you gave because someone needed it. But she only smiled at that, a quiet, almost mysterious smile that seemed to say she knew something he didn't. Without explaining, she asked him to come with her. Curiosity stirred in Daniel, though a part of him hesitated. Still, he grabbed his keys and followed her. They drove through the edges of town, the streets growing quieter, the houses farther apart, until they reached a small, tree-lined road he didn't recognize. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, dappling the pavement in gold and shadow. Claire slowed her car, then pulled over in front of a two-story house that looked like something out of a dream Daniel had stopped having years ago. The siding was painted a soft cream, fresh and bright against the deep green of the lawn. White-trimmed windows caught the sunlight and winked back at him. A wide porch wrapped along the front, complete with a pair of rocking chairs that seemed built for warm summer evenings and long stories told in the fading light. A "for sale" sign stood in the yard, its colors crisp and new. Claire turned to him, her expression steady, and pressed something into his hand. A set of keys. For a moment, Daniel just stared at them, unable to comprehend what he was holding. His first thought was that it was a joke, some strange, misplaced gesture that couldn't possibly be real. But when he looked back at her, she was already speaking, her voice soft but certain. She told him she had the means to buy it, and that she had done so for him and his son. She said it wasn't about the gas he'd pumped for her or the sandwich he'd handed over that day. It was about something far greater, the fact that, for one small, fragile moment, he had made her feel seen, safe, and human again, at a time when she had felt invisible and broken. Daniel's throat tightened. He didn't know how to speak. He could only stand there, feeling the years pressing down on him all at once. The endless grind of work, the constant juggling of bills, the quiet sacrifices no one ever noticed, the sleepless nights spent wondering if he was doing enough for his boy. And now, standing in front of this house, this gift he could never have imagined, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope. Pure, unshakable hope. Claire moved away a few days later, starting her life over in a place she didn't name. They stayed in touch for a while, Christmas cards with pictures of her and her son, the occasional letter or phone call with updates about new jobs, new towns, new beginnings. But even after the contact faded, the house remained. For Daniel and his boy, it became more than a home. It was a living symbol of the moment a stranger's kindness had turned the tide of their lives, of the truth that compassion could still exist in a world that so often felt cold and unyielding. It was proof that even the smallest gesture could ripple outward in ways no one could predict. On summer nights, Daniel would sit on that porch, his son curled up beside him, the air warm and filled with the sound of crickets. He would think about the day at the gas station, about the trembling woman in the white dress and the boy who wouldn't look up. He would think about how everything had changed because he hadn't walked away. And in those quiet moments, under the fading light, he would smile, not just for the life they now had, but for the reminder that sometimes the greatest miracles begin with something as small as a sandwich, a bottle of water, and a decision to stop and care.